I would like to welcome Tony Hyman. And he's a professor and is a research group leader and director since 1999 at the Max Planck Institute of Molecular Cell Biology and Genetics in Dresden, Germany. Hyman became honorary professor of molecular cell biology in 2002 at Dresden University of Technology after receiving his PhD in molecular cell biology 1988 at King's College, Cambridge. In 2011, he received the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize and was elected Fellow of the Royal Society in 2007. Please welcome Tony Hyman, who will talk about encouraging innovation through peer review and evaluation.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for giving me the chance to talk about a subject that's very close to my heart, which is encouraging innovation in young scientists. And when Anna and Bruce asked me to come and talk about this, I had to think about what I wanted to say, because although I've written about it quite a lot, I've never actually given a presentation on the problem. The reason I thought about the problem of encouraging innovation in young scientists is that I had the chance at an early age to go to Dresden soon after reunification and convert this car park, this tram station, to a modern, to build a research institute. And of course, the question came up, when you're going into the middle of nowhere, as it was at that time, how do you create a modern motor of innovation? Because of course, if we step back and ask the question, why societies fund basic research, I think governments think because they understand that novel innovations come from blue skies research. I think that's sort of accepted, and it's a motor of innovation. And everybody, of course, always points to these examples, such as Silicon Valley or Periclean Athens or the Laboratory of Molecular Biology, where I did my PhD with its 18 Nobel Prizes. And so there's an understanding that that is essential for innovation. And yet I think I'd like to argue today that the modern system of metrics and impact factor is actually stifling the very aspect that people would like to fund. Because let's step back and think about how we actually select people for doing basic research. Because we often forget, if you look at a funnel like that, we take a very, very small number of students all the way through to become professor. This is a little bit difficult to get the actual numbers, but in America, if you start with 4 million ninth graders, you probably, who take what's STEM, which is the sort of science subjects, you probably end up from those 4 million every year about 100 professors. So it's a very, very, very small group, and that, of course, is how it's always worked in history. Through an education process, you select and you select and you select and you select to get these few people that really seem good for research. And then, of course, you evaluate it. You would like to evaluate it based on the discovery or inventions, right? That these people, when you fund them, will make important discoveries and important inventions, just as Bruce introduced beautifully in his talk. Those we know will be the motors of our society and the innovation and jobs for our children in the future. But of course, we now know the problem is that young scientists are being evaluated less and less and less by these aspects of discovery and innovation because it's much harder to quantify them. How do you quantify discovery? How do you quantify invention? Of course, you can do it by the iPhone. That's an invention, or that's something which we know was very important for society. But much of the basic research we do is a very, very long-term process which can't be evaluated over a short period of time. And so what's happened, of course, and this is the title on the aspect of what we're talking about today, is that more and more it's been given over to the journals. You can publish in Nature or Cell or Science. This is a classic thing that a young person, it's really scary to talk to postdocs in the lab about how they see that if they don't get a paper in one of these journals, they might as well give up their career. Certainly when I was in Harvard recently, that was absolutely certain among the postdocs. No paper in these journals, no career. And of course, we have even worse metrics, such as the H index. She didn't go out with you, even though you told you an H index of 37. Boy, I don't understand women. And that's the sort of joke that sort of makes the point about how important scientists are seeing it. And of course, the dreaded impact factor. as Bruce and it previously mentioned, this terrible factor that's been completely misused. It should be used to evaluate journals, and it's used to evaluate individuals. So why is it such a problem, then, that we are now evaluating young scientists based on these factors? Well, I think it's quite simple. Because, of course, where you've published has absolutely nothing to do with whether you've made a discovery. It may be, and it's probably true that the higher impact journals publish more discoveries, but many things, of course, which are discoveries are not published in high impact journals. And this is what's really happening now, and this is what you see when you talk to young people. Career and discovery are conflated. They're thought to be the same thing. Scientists know that if they publish in Nature, that'll help their career, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're making any discoveries. But scientists begin to see career as more important than discovery because that's what they're rewarded for. It's like teaching to the test. If we make scientists rewarded for career, i.e. publishing in Nature gets you your next job, publishing in Nature gets you your postdoc fellowship, then of course that's what young people will begin to work towards. I mean, everybody who needs a job, they want to be supporting their families, and the first thing they're going to do is make sure their career is stabilized. And discovery begins to trickle away as a basic motive of what you're trying to do in science. Now, and one of the problems have come, of course, from this, as we've been discussing, is this issue of impact factor. Now, I don't want to talk too much about impact factor today because I'm just echoing what others have said. I think no one in this room would deny the fact that it's a dreadful or hopeless way to measure the success of individual scientists. And I just want to show one particular case, which I thought was rather nice, that a colleague of mine, Pavel Tamanchuk, pointed out to me, which is how impact factor is not even gamed. It just comes out of the desire to publish good papers, which is, let's say the 2000 impact factor is A over B, where A is a number of times all items published in the journal 2012 and 2013 were cited, divided by the total number of citable items. Nature Methods in 2012 had an impact factor of 23. Suddenly in 2014 it jumped to 32 and everyone got very excited. Why was that? Well, let's rank the papers then by citation, and you'll see there's one paper at the top that has 3,500 citations there. And it was about ImageJ, which many of you will know, which is an available free software for doing image analysis that came originally out of NIH. So you can look at these skewed citations, and here it is, miles away. But that is the one thing that raises the impact factor by 10, so that's clearly crazy, right? You can't base a system where the impact factor is based on this sort of problem. And just as Bruce said, I mean, I don't think the system's been gamed probably as much as, say, Volkswagen was doing it. But still, there's plenty of opportunity for gaming the system if it's that easy. So that is the problem. The fact is then that all of these focus on impact factor as a way of publishing these top journals has this big problem, which is it stops the young innovating. So I wrote an article recently that Bruce asked me to editorial in Science, where I said the problem now is that traditionally, for thousands of years, young people are the motor of innovation. Old people are there to sort of educate and help keep them in line and not get too out of control, but young people are meant to be the ones that are innovating, as we see in Silicon Valley. But of course, the necessity for metrics means that young scientists now are looking over their shoulders all the time. They need preliminary data to get a job, so they have to carry on with experiments from their postdoc. They're constantly reviewed, so they have to produce short-term research, and they constantly have to get papers in the high-profile journals, which often means doing Me Too science, the trendy stuff that Bruce was talking about, the orange areas, or was it the white ones? I can't remember. The orange areas, the ones you stick in, and don't get out of that. And so we're stifling the very motor of innovation that we need to drive our society ahead. And so then the question, of course, is what can we do to avoid that? Now, Bruce already brought up the point about DORA, which is we mustn't use journal-based metrics, such as impact factor, as a surrogate measure for the quality of individual research articles, or to assess a scientist's contributions in hiring, promotion, or funding. More importantly, we must be explicit about the criteria we use to examine scientific productivity. This is extremely difficult. You can tell a postdoc in your lab till you're blue in the face. If you publish in eLife or you publish in Cell, it's not going to have a major effect on whether you get a job or not, but they don't believe you. But we have to work on that by showing, that's exactly how we evaluate people, is that we have to show that we should be used for evaluating the scientific productivity of grant applications and clearly highlight, especially for early-stage investigators, that the scientific content of a paper is much more important than publication metrics, just as Bruce mentioned that Sandy Schmidt is doing. And here's something we've implemented in all our hiring decisions, which is you are not allowed to mention ever that this person had a paper in Cell or Nature or Science in any hiring discussion. Right? We started banning that. Where when you're selecting people to interview, someone say, but they've got this paper in Cell, that's a banned subject. And that's already been a good help, actually. We notice now that we're inviting a lot more people for interview who have papers not in the sort of top-tier journals. There's also another way to fund young scientists. And actually, I think we have to be proud in Europe that we are really beginning to push this model forward, in contrast to the United States, which has been much worse in addressing the problem of how to get young people funded. And that came out of the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, which has been a European model in how to fund young scientists and a motive of innovation. It was set up as a new experiment to fund group leaders, which was the following. And it was based on, in a way, it was just based on the vagaries of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which is after 9 years, you had to give someone a permanent position. So this was set up originally by the people from the LMB, such as Sidney Brenner and Francis Crick, not Sidney Brenner, sorry, and John Kendrew. And what they did is they just wanted to take young scientists, give them 9 years of funding, come back at the end and find out what they've done. And this has been taken up by the ERC, of course. The ERC is something we should also celebrate in Europe, because it funds 3 groups of people as well. It funds young people, starting people, and senior people. And this is the important thing that the ERC has done, and this is what I think is crucial. It's separated from each other so that each career stage is evaluated independently. Starting group leaders only compete with starting group leaders, consolidators with consolidators, and seniors with seniors. So therefore, the senior scientists can mentor the young people without worrying too much about their own funding, the competition from the young guys, because they're completely evaluated separately. And the explicit mandate at ERC, of course, is blue skies research, although, of course, it's not always followed, but it's good to make that. So in other words, in Europe, we now have this sort of starting idea of how to go back to the old way of just funding innovation, of giving young people the chance to do a new idea. Because that's, in fact, in a way, how we've always operated in the Max Planck Society, although I'm first to say it's not a perfect situation, which is when you become a director, you have permanent funding for the rest of your career. But how are those directors selected? Many different young groups are funded, of course, around Europe, and you try and select those to give money to for the rest of their careers, who will then go on and do something important. So what are you trying to assess then when you're looking at a young group leader? You're trying to assess the chances that they've done something novel, which will go on to be an important bit of work. And that's what's really essential, is that, as Bruce was saying, it's so complicated now that science that we don't know what the right way ahead is. No one can stand here and say, how are we going to use all this information to move ahead to do the next stage? So you have to set, of course, all these little seeds in action of what way to go, and those are the young group leaders. And from those, you can then select those who came up with innovative ideas to then fund them to see if that really was important. In other words, and this is an idea I've been floating in sort of seminar tours in the US, which is, imagine that when you're a postdoc, and this is, instead of going through some complicated negotiation with your PI to take some of the work with you, to be allowed a small slice of it, to be able to do what you wanted, to have some preliminary data. It was completely different. Where you hired in a group was entirely based on the innovative proposal you had. Something new, something different. Because that's why people can't get out of the orange area into the white area, because they're not encouraged to do that. If, on the other hand, you had a system where the seniors work in the orange areas, why do you need new people to come into that area? The job of a young person is to identify a new area and go into it. And all of the hiring decisions are based on that. The productivity of the papers you did in your postdoc is a demonstration you can do research, but you go into blue skies research when you start as an innovative proposal. And that is great because, of course, we know young people have much more flexible minds. That's the whole point. And so if you said to somebody, that's the job, that would make postdocs so much more exciting. They'd all sit around and go, yeah, what I wanted, this is a good idea, what about doing this? And then I think you would lead to a much more vibrant postdoc community. Then you can imagine giving them 9 years to find something, to see if that really is an interesting idea. And those people who had innovated can be given 20 years of funding to try and realize this idea. And then we've really simplified the whole process, where innovation is at the heart of the whole process rather than this issue of what you've published. Because you make the publications not the crucial aspect about whether you go on to the next stage. Now, let's also step back a bit and think of the problem, because why has this problem of review by impact factor arisen? Now, you could say, who cares about impact factor? It doesn't really matter if it wasn't being used for evaluation. That's the problem, is the fact it's used for evaluation. And you could say there are two reasons. One is science is very expensive, and administrators and governments want value for money. And maybe we have more and more requirement for impact factor because science is getting more and more expensive, so governments are feeling the pinch. But there's no evidence whatsoever in the West to show that's true at all. Funding has basically stayed somewhat constant over a large period of time. It's going up a little bit, but it's not really an enormous increase outside Asia. Rather, the problem is there are just too many people. This is an amazing graph I dug up from the ASBMB, which suggests that the number of tenured faculty in biomedical research, or tenure track it's actually saying here, has stayed roughly constant in 1979, which was hard for me to believe. But the number of postdocs, which is shown in blue, is going up and up and up and up. So that means that one of the reasons that we now do review by impact factor, I believe, is just there's too much review to do. And so you need some surrogate mechanism. I know that in my career, it's like the amount of review I have to do is sometimes almost intolerable in terms of the papers and the group leaders. I'm flying around the world all the time to review young people because there's more and more and more of this number of people coming in to the workforce. So that means that rather than what we need to do then is to actually make peer review a more important part of our job. And that's what I just want to talk about now, just to go into the after-lunch session. Because here's my point about peer review. It must be treasured. I try and make this in all talks that I give. We're incredibly lucky as a community that we're spending billions and billions of dollars of taxpayers' research, and we're allowed to evaluate ourselves. You think about an administrator. What other system are you allowed to evaluate yourself? And that's how we do by peer review. I would argue that it's been disastrous, the drop of print news to the internet, for the following reason, that they've no longer fact-checked. A good journal like that, a good newspaper, there used to be sub-editors checking all the facts. That's why I always really love watching this series, The Newsroom. If anyone's never watched that, it's a great description of what an old-style newsroom was and how it's becoming like the internet. This doesn't matter so much to people in this room, probably, because we're educated enough to look at different information and work out how to make different stories. But most population, which is not able to evaluate different sources, means that they start to think about it without really thinking about what the real aspect of it is. So in other words, this is what I think about peer review. It's extremely precious and must be protected against all costs. and I want to say it was telling to Brendan this morning, I'm definitely not against post-peer review or archive servers, but we must not get a peer review. In other words, it's even more important, I would say, not to see it as an add-on, but it must be recognized and remunerated, just like teaching. Because of the huge burdens placed on modern scientists, you tend to do last of all what isn't essential. So we all know that we have our papers to review, and they get done on Sunday afternoon. And the journals are writing to us more and more desperately to get the review back. And rather, you need to say this is an important part of the process. And there should be huge amounts of money available to get review done properly. I mean, you think, let's say the Max Planck with its 1.3 billion euros. Let's say you took, say, 10% of that should be taken to make sure the work is done properly. It'd be $130 million. No one's saying we should put that much money into it. But say 1% would still be 13 million euros. A lot of money available to do it properly. In other words, I personally think that every granting body or journal should have a pool of paid reviewers whose job it is to actually do that. And we are already seeing how successful that is in eLife, and I was involved in establishing eLife because there the editors are paid. We have this board of reviewing editors, and they are paid to do the job. And they're scientists like me, but of course, because they're part of your job, far more effort is being put into that process. I know people will see this as heterodox, aren't we scientists, aren't we meant to do everything? But the fact is the system is creaking because the few faculty who are evaluating more and more people have more and more work to do, and they're not able to do all the work. And I just want to end with 2 points, which is, first of all, innovation requires freedom to fail. Science is about failure and waste. And that's why quantifying it month after month is such a problem, because Fred Sanger, who was still in the LMB when I did my PhD, once told me as a student, 95% of all my experiments failed, and this is probably an underestimate. So, the system needs to encourage failure by not over-reviewing it all the time and just seeing how people have done on a day-to-day basis. And finally, I want to finish with a quote from Max Perutz, who was also at the LMB when I started, and he was the one who really got the LMB going with its 18 Nobel Prizes, the 15 Nobel Prize winners. And he told, I think he's quoted in the press once as saying the following: earnest young men would come round with their clipboards to find out how I'd done it, how we did it. And I'd always say, we hired good people, we gave them the right conditions, and we got out of their way. And that is the secret to innovation. Take young people, fund them, and come back 10 years later and find out what they discovered. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony Hyman. Is there any question from the audience?
Hi. You were the first one that addressed the peer review here today. I would like your comment on if you agree that blind peer reviewing would be better than the normal way. Because I guess that you might agree with me that if I, as a graduate student, sent out a very fantastic paper, I have like 0 chances of getting into Nature, whereas if my professor does it, probably, and he's a renowned one, he probably has much more chance. Thanks.
One of the things that's interesting, I mean, I could just comment it from the eLife point of view, which is one of the things we came up with in eLife. We review the following way, is you submit your reviews, 3 reviewers, and then all 3 reviewers get to see each other's review. And then we have a discussion online about that. At the beginning, everybody was worried that these junior people wouldn't submit a review because they might be read by the senior person who would review, or they would not disagree with a senior person. But we haven't found that to be true at all, basically. So I think that, that the blind peer review would just take away this extra aspect you use in terms of evaluating people, which is smart people pick smart people. This is basically the point of it. My talk, if I say anything, you can't end up quantifying research, because research is a matter of taste, and it's the smart people from the previous generation who should be selecting the next generation. So.
Thank you. And
So you put the fault of the system clearly on peer review and the lack of peer review.
Well, on the amount of time that's available to do the peer review, exactly, yes.
But I don't see the link between how, if we had more peer review, that would change the reliance on impact factor. Do you mean peer review at selection committees and NIH sections?
Yeah,
or
exactly,
in
yes,
journals?
exactly. I mean, it's the point I was making about, maybe it's a good point, I should clarify that, is that the problem is that at the level of hiring, people don't have the time to read the papers. And that's what I mean. Sorry, I should be more general about peer review. I mean, fundamentally, you get away from all the problem impact factors. But we introduced something in our institute, which is working very well, is that every time you evaluate somebody, we have to do a journal club on the paper. And once you start doing the journal club on the paper, of course, you see the science papers, no good, actually, and the journal of bacteriology paper was much better. But that requires a lot of time, and so you have to have the time to do that. And that's especially true for grants. That's probably the most important thing I would say, which is that I often get desperate requests from funding organizations around Europe to try and review, and I just don't have the time to do it. And I know from talking to Wellcome Trust, they can send out 20 requests and get 3 back.
And so you're advocating that these are the reviewers that should be paid, not the reviewers of the journals?
Well, both, basically. You want the journal's papers reviewed properly. To answer your question at the back, is that maybe, to be more precise there, is that one of the problems is that when, let's say I'm reviewing papers come in, I have to resist the fact that it's coming from a big lab at MIT and say it's more important than a graduate student who's submitting it. But if I had more time to do my job properly, then I could actually read it and then properly and then really go through it before making a decision. And so I think if you're paying someone to do that, and that's what Randy Sheckman said when he set up eLife. He said, I'm not going to review for any more boards. I mean, I get paid for a lot of scientific advisory boards. I'll just get rid of those, and I'll just be paid to run the journal. And I feel the same way, too, about eLife. I feel it's my job. I feel really committed to eLife because I'm actually basically employed to work on it.
thank you. We have time for one more question.
Very interesting discussion, actually. I have worked with peer review and peer things even in the bachelor and master thesis courses. What is really interesting for me is that don't you think hiring people would limit the how can I say, the evaluation perspectives? Is like that, having the peer reviews from wherever, as you said, to sending the request to 20%.
Yes.
And just 3% maybe accept it. But still, those 3% are kind of random.
Yes.
Wouldn't it be better in the community of science publications?
That's a good point. But I think to have some sort of standards, it seems to be much better to have a set of people that are reviewing, have reviewed many more grants at the Wellcome Trust, know what the Wellcome Trust is looking for, can help the Wellcome Trust give advice. The key thing would be those groups should turn over. That's all. You just don't want to be there for too long, so they end up having too much of a say-so on the matter.
Okay, thank you, Tony Hyman.
Okay.